At 9:18 a.m. on August 1, 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker was flying a burning B-24 bomber straight into a wall of flak he could have turned away from. Ahead of him were the smokestacks and cracking towers of the Ploiești oil refineries, the most heavily defended target in Europe. Behind him were 17 other Liberators depending on his nose to point the right way. Under his boots, the aluminum floor of Hell's Wench vibrated with the uneven hammering of engines that were spraying flame and fuel from torn lines. Off to his right, Major John Jerstad, the co-pilot who'd already finished his tour of duty and had volunteered for this one last mission, kept one hand on the throttles and the other braced on the side window, looking out at a sky that looked like someone had hung a black curtain full of holes and fire between them and the ground. They could see the escape valleys to either side. Baker could have broken away, dumped his bomb short, and tried to crash land in a Romanian field. Instead, he shoved the control yoke forward and held their burning ship in the lead so that the men behind him would have a clear aiming point. Everyone in Hell's Wench knew exactly what that meant. Months of training and 1,000 little decisions had led them to that exact 3-minute stretch of time. It had started for this mission long before dawn at an airfield in Libya. At 6:47 a.m. on that hot North African morning, the sun just high enough to throw harsh shadows under wings and into open bomb bays, Baker and Jerstad had climbed into the cockpit of their B-24D Liberator, Hell's Wench, at Benghazi. To either side and behind them, 4 more bomb groups, 76th, 93rd, 98th, 44th, and 389th, were doing the same. 178 heavy bombers were preparing to launch for what would be, in distance and method, the longest and lowest deep strike bomb. Precise navigation, split-second timing, tight formation flying at altitudes where a mistake wasn't a bruised ego, it was an impact crater. The 8th Air Force, which was responsible for the mission, even though these groups were temporarily based in North Africa, had already paid part of the price before anyone went anywhere near Romania. Low-level training in the desert and over water had cost them at least 47 B-24s. Crews misjudging their height over the sea and flying into the water at 200 miles per hour. Pilots misreading the terrain and plowing into unseen rises and ridges. Collisions in tight, dust-clouded formations where one split second of inattention turned 2 airplanes into flaming wreckage. They learned to fly a 56,000-pound, 4-engine bomber at heights that only a few years earlier had been the domain of barnstormers. They learned to judge 50 feet off the deck by the blur of grass and shrubs under their noses. They learned what it felt like to have tall weeds slap at the belly of a bomber loaded with gasoline and bombs. Commanders knew the arithmetic. X bombers times Y defenses equals Z losses. The planners of Tidal Wave estimated they could lose as many as 90 aircraft over the target area alone. 900 men gone in one morning if the flak and fighters did their worst. When those numbers made their way into group briefings, they weren't sugar-coated. Baker and Jerstad knew them. They also knew why the mission mattered enough to accept them. For Baker, the responsibility had a particular weight. He was 36, with roughly 11 months of hard combat already behind him as commander of the Ploiești 93rd Bomb Group. The 93rd, the traveling circus, had shuttled all over the European theater, North Africa, England, the Mediterranean. Its crews had flown in the daylight brutality of the 8th Air Force's raids on German and in the desert heat of North African targets. He wasn't some desk commander flown in for one big show. He'd put in his time over occupied France and the Ruhr, seen the beams of German searchlights crisscross around his formation, felt flak bumps that knocked engines out. Major John L. Jerstad, his co-pilot for this mission, was younger, 25 years old. He'd already completed his required 25 missions over Europe 3 weeks before Tidal Wave. He had his ticket home. He could have been on a ship or plane headed back to Oregon, telling friends in taverns about the cold blue haze over Germany and the neat formations of contrails in the upper air. Instead, When Baker needed someone in the right seat who understood both the plan and the stakes, Jerstad had stepped forward and volunteered. As operations officer, he knew the mission layout better than almost anyone. He knew its flaws as well. Both men knew that Ploiești's refineries pumped out around 12 million barrels of refined product a year. Every day those refineries ran, panzer divisions in Russia burned their fuel on the steppe. Luftwaffe aircraft took off from airfields across Europe. U-boats pushed out to try to strangle Britain. If they could knock a significant chunk out of that output, even temporarily, they might shorten the war by months, blunt an upcoming offensive, let thousands of other airmen, soldiers, and sailors live out the year who'd otherwise die for lack of that disruption. That was the argument, at least, sitting on briefing room chairs hours before takeoff. In the quiet after the briefing, when men went back to their dispersal tents and checked maps by flashlight and wrote quick notes home, the numbers had a way of shrinking and expanding at the same time. 50% expected casualties, someone had said. The sort of forecast that, if you believed it literal, I meant you and the man on the bunk above you needed to flip a coin. When the time came, there wasn't time for statistics. At 7:20 a.m., the first groups began rolling. On the hardpan of Benghazi airfield, 4 engine bombers lined up in rows, noses pointed down the dusty strip. One after another, bombers like hell's Wench opened their throttles to military power, shook themselves loose from red desert dust, climbed into the morning sky still streaked with the last fading traces of other raids and reconnaissance flights. They formed up over the Mediterranean, a loose spiral tightening into ordered boxes of B-24s. At around 19,000 feet, the 5 bomb groups sorted themselves into their planned tracks. From the ground, the armada would have looked like a slow-moving city in the sky, white contrails weaving in long file, the glint of sunlight off plexiglass noses and spinning props. From the cockpits, it was businesslike. Checklists, formation spacing, fuel monitors. The knowledge that this long climb would only be the prelude to something more uncomfortable, because once they'd cleared the comfortable height over the sea, they were going to drop. Crossing the Greek coast, the formation began to descend. 9,000 feet over jagged terrain, then lower. Across Duaso, Yugoslavia, they dropped to Bitna, 500 feet, and, in some places, less. Villagers in mountain valleys looked up from tending sheep and saw the improbable sight of American 4-engine bombers roaring overhead so low that men in the nose could see their expressions. Sheep and cattle scattered as the B-24s ripped along valleys, the air under their wings compressed and angry. This low-level phase wasn't just bravado. German radar installations, tuned to pick up aircraft specs at medium and high altitudes, had blind spots close to the ground. If the Liberators could stay below the crest lines, they might slip in under the surveillance net for low, but low-level cost them. It cost them fuel. Engines at high power and constant micro-adjustments fought drag, more than smooth, thin-air cruising would have. It cost them safety margin. At 200 feet, there was no room for an inattentive navigator or a map error. Any mountain whose peak you misjudged wasn't a dot on a chart. It was a vertical wall, and you hit it, or you didn't. They'd practiced for this. They'd paid for the practice. Even so, over the Adriatic and Balkans, things began to go wrong. Roughly 3 hours into the mission, over the Mediterranean, a B-24 from the lead navigation group lost power. It happened without drama at first. A quirk in one engine that couldn't be balanced, then another. A sickening drop in manifold pressure at the worst time. The bomber that lost power that day was carrying the mission's single-white lead navigator. The pathfinder whose specialized charts and rehearsed turns were supposed to be the spine everyone else followed. Out over the sea, with no room to turn back and no place to land other than the water, the crew tried for a ditching. They came in at around 140 miles per hour. On film, water looks soft. At that speed, it's concrete. Hellish Wench's pilots and crews elsewhere in the formation saw the attempted landing only as a brief, bright splash and the disintegrating carcass of an airplane. The sea swallowed the men aboard. The mission had just lost the only navigator who knew the full route intimately. There were other navigators in other noses, but none had the same complete set of mental and paper maps. The column pressed on. Baker knew something important. From this point on, every man in a nose with a chart was going to be under unusual strain. Crossing the rugged ridges and valleys of Yugoslavia and into Bulgaria, the Liberators hugged ground that was increasingly unfamiliar. At low level, the world looks different. What seemed like a clear route on a high-altitude chart becomes a mess of ridges, drainages, and deceptive cuts when you're below the peaks. At about 9:05 a.m. Romanian time, the strike force reached its planned initial point. Near Ploiești, this was supposed to be the clean pivot point. Here, each group would recognize landmarks, towns, rivers, ridgelines, turn at exactly the specified spot, and follow specific valleys and corridors to their assigned refineries. Without the pathfinder, the job of navigation had shifted to other aircraft. In the lead position for the overall mission, a Liberator carrying the mission commander began its turn. From Baker's seat in Hell's Wench, leading the 93rd's formation, he watched the lead group swing, smoothly, confidently, in what he knew was the wrong direction. They were turning toward Bucharest, not Ploiești, a valley that at 5 or 10,000 feet might have looked like the right choice had led them a few degrees off. At 500 feet, that small error unfolded into a 30-mile miss. You couldn't see the refineries from that distance at that altitude. You could see valleys and towns. If you mistook one for another, you could take 100 aircraft worth of bombs to the wrong city. In the noise and vibration of his cockpit, Baker saw it happen in real time. The lead group angled southeast. The 3 bomb groups following it obediently began to turn with it, over 100 bombers, full of men and ordnance, sliding off the proper line. Behind and slightly above, he flipped his seat mic on, grabbed his radio trigger, and tried to raise the mission commander. Radio discipline had been strict all morning, for good reason. German listening posts could triangulate sloppy chatter. Now, with his navigator and his own eyes screaming that the mission's heart was being dragged out of position, Baker broke the silence. He called repeatedly. Static. Snatches of phrases drowned in hash. German jamming had begun the moment they approached the Romanian border, spitting noise into the same frequencies the Americans needed most. Either the lead aircraft wasn't on the same channel at that moment, or they simply couldn't hear each other. Jerstad looked over at him across the center pedestal, his own eyes tracking the turn. He saw the same wrong valley, the same deviation. The options narrowed in that small hot cockpit. Follow the main body to the wrong target and drop bombs on something that wasn't the Ploiești complex, wasting the mission and all the risk that had gone into it. Or do the unthinkable at this stage of a long, low-level penetration. Break away, turn your group alone toward the intended target, and lead 17 bombers into what you knew, from all the briefings and stories, was the densest anti-aircraft concentration in Europe, without the relief that would have come from the coordinated 5-group strike. The plan had called for AMON-94 bombers to hit Ploiești together. Now, thanks to a simple navigational slip and radio noise, it was going to be fewer. Baker made the decision in seconds. He banked Hell's Wench hard left, pulling away from the track the lead group was taking. Behind him, disciplined American pilots from the 93rd Bomb Group saw the group leader move and followed. 18 bombers, Hell's Wench and her 17 squadron mates, curved away. leaving the bulk of the force angling toward Bucharest. On the ground, German radar sets and lookouts watchfully tracking the incoming mass saw that split on their scopes and in the sky. Orders went out along flak positions and barrage balloon winch crews around Ploiești. Small group approaching from the south, 18 aircraft, low, about 500 feet, heading directly for refineries. Concentrate all fire on them. The Luftwaffe fighters, Bf-109s, FW-190s, and Romanian IAR-81s, waited. The flak would get first crack. The defense plan called for dragging the bombers through an intensity of fire that would, ideally, break them up and force them higher. Fighters could then carve burning bombers out of the broken pieces. As Hell's Wench led the 93rd forward, the city built for oil loomed ahead. 7 major refineries sprawled across the landscape, a tangle of pipelines, rectangular tank farms, spider-legged cracking towers, rows of chimneys and smokestacks belching heavy black smoke, rail yards full of tank cars and freight wagons. Between and above many of these installations hung the WAVE barrage balloons. By some counts, up to 300 tons, in the Ploiești defense network. Each balloon was a bulging, gas-filled cigar hanging a long steel cable down toward the ground. Flying into that at low level was like flying into an invisible forest of metal ropes. Above them was flak. In front of them was steel wire. Below them was concrete and pipes. Baker had no real room to change altitude. The mission parameters for bombing demanded that they drop at one chimney height, around 400 to 500 feet. The delayed fuse bombs they carried needed that low drop and a short delay to punch into refinery structures before detonating. If they dropped from higher, bombs might go off in the air or on top of tanks instead of ripping into the harder-to-replace guts of distillation units and pumping stations. If they went much lower, they'd be in the zone where even a small error, a telephone pole, a tank car, a building, would turn a bomber into scrap. Hell's Wench and the other 93rd bombers pushed into what one crewman later called a boiler made of sky. The first 88mm shell burst about 200 feet in front of Baker's nose. A hard black puff with a yellow-orange core. The fragments from that one shell were enough to perforate aluminum skin and hoses. There were hundreds more shells on the air. German gun crews on the outskirts of the city had the range now. Every gun that could bear opened up. The undertone roar of engines was overlaid with a savage rattling thunder as proximity-fused and contact-fused shells exploded in patterns carefully plotted by rangefinders and directors. From the B-24 cockpits, the world became a thicket of black puffs. Jagged shards of smoke. Long, bright tracer lines from lighter guns stabbing up. Pilots couldn't see through it properly. You flew by instinct and glimpses. A balloon cable loomed directly in front of Hell's Wench. At that altitude, there was barely time to register it before you were on it. Baker hauled the yoke left. The bomber banked hard, wingtip close enough to the ground that men inside windows could see individual fence posts and tin roofs sliding under. The cable snapped past 20 feet off the wingtip. Another cable shot up on the other side as they slid between them. Jerstad called them out, voice hard and precise. Cable high left, cable low right, flak at 1 o'clock. The nose gunner saw a balloon cradle whip past his field of view, its cable humming with tension. The top turret gunner swiveled uselessly, his guns more for decoration here than real defense, scanning for fighters that hadn't yet made their entrance. 3 miles from the target. 3 minutes of flying time. In the bombardier's compartment, John McCormick pushed his face closer to the bombsight glass, trying to reconcile the maze of chimneys and tanks ahead with the idealized, clean diagrams from the briefing. It wasn't neat. Smoke from burning installations, hit or sabotaged, already smeared the air, hiding some of the features he'd been told to look for. On his map, Astra Romana and the adjacent refineries were crisp ink drawings. In front of his glass, they were hell. An 88mm shell exploded below Hell's Wench. The upward blast lifted the bomber, slamming its belly with shrapnel. Metal shrieked. In the cockpit, red warning lights flicked into life across Baker's instrument panel. Fuel pressure dropping in Engine 3. Oil temperature creeping up in Engine 1. Hydraulic fluid pressure sagging. Somewhere in the back, a gunner yelled as fragments punched through armor plate and into his compartment. The intercom crackled with overlapping reports. Tails hit! Number 3's on fire! We've got fuel in the bomb bay! Despite that, all 4 engines were still turning. Controls still moved when Baker pushed or pulled. The big, boxy bomber was wounded, not yet killed. They were about 2 miles from their assigned aim point. He could see the target area now, when the smoke gusted, in stuttering, awful detail. The main tank farms at Astra Romana. The long ranks of cracking units and distillation towers. The spiderweb of pipes and gantries glinting in fierce Romanian sun. And above, and between, and occasionally below those structures, more balloon cables. Here, at this precise point, was where any rational pilot flying a crippled aircraft would have considered an alternative. Jettison the bombs early, before reaching the heart of the defenses. Break off the run. Turn for the nearest patch of open countryside. Get the crew out while there was still altitude left to bail from and some semblance of control. They had, after all, already penetrated further than many had thought possible. They could plausibly claim afterward that had they stayed 1 more minute, they would have disintegrated before delivering. Jerstad knew the options as well as Baker. He'd flown enough missions to know when a ship was just holed and when it was courting catastrophe. He also knew what was behind them. A string of B-24s, each laden with bombs, each crew trusting that the man in the lead ship knew where he was going and would get them over the target in the right configuration. If Hell's Wench peeled off now, at this altitude, in this maelstrom, the formation would likely split. Bomb runs would be sloppy. Some crews, robbed of the visual guide of the lead, might drop late, early, or on the wrong complex entirely. Baker didn't move his hand toward the emergency bomb salvo lever. He kept it on the yoke. He did what men like him were built, trained, and promoted to do. He flew the plan. He pointed Hell's Wench's nose at Astra Romana. Jerstad never suggested otherwise. The co-pilot's job in that moment wasn't to talk his commander out of the suicide run. It was to keep one eye on the engines, one hand ready to help, and his mind locked on the singular thought. Keep this burning plane on course long enough for the man in the nose to do his job. The last mile in. The flak thickened. The bomb run itself, in theory, was supposed to be straight and level. Bomb sites of the era, the Norden and Sperry units, needed a relatively steady platform and a bit of time to settle on the target for a good solution. At Ploiești, that meant McCormack in the nose had to fight his own instincts. Every detonation and near hit made the airframe shudder, making the crosshairs jump. Every balloon cable that whipped past in the corner of his vision screamed at him to tell the pilot to climb, dive, or turn. He didn't. Instead, he called minor corrections. Left, left, steady, hold it. Hell's Wench, streaming smoke and fuel, its right wing nicked by a cable, its belly holed, flew on. Behind it, the other 93rd Bomb Group aircraft held their line as best they could, trying to stay in the slipstream of something that looked increasingly doomed. At the exact slice of seconds they'd calculated from Benghazi's briefing hut, over target, McCormack toggled the release. The bomb bay doors had already been open, wind clawing at the interior. Now the aircraft leaped fractionally as thousands of pounds of high explosives dropped free. Delayed inclusive bombs, most set with fuses to detonate several seconds after impact, fell into the chaotic garden of steel and concrete below. Some hit pipeline runs, rupturing them and turning them into flamethrowers. Some punched into the sides of tanks. Some drilled down between units and went off in the guts of machinery that had been carefully put in place over years. Others hit ground that had been softened by earlier raids and sabotages, blasting upward in gray fountains. Around and behind Hell's Wench, other 93rd aircraft released in their turn. The sky above Ploiești, already filthy with smoke and flak, gained a layer of falling steel and destruction. Only now, bombs away, did Baker and Jerstad allow themselves to start thinking about their crewmen in back. Baker pulled up, trying to get a couple 100 feet of extra sky under them, and bleed off some speed, hoping to give gunners and waist crew a chance to move to escape hatches. They both knew the danger. Climbing made them a better target for fighters and flak. Staying low meant that any bailout would be a messy, terrifying thing at treetop level. Accounts vary on exactly how much altitude they were able to gain. What they agree on is that the combination of fire, fuel, and structural damage caught up with them quickly. One report has Hell's Wench rolling slowly to the right, losing lift on the damaged wing. Another remembers a sudden renewed burst of flame from the wing root as a fuel tank finally surrendered to heat and shrapnel. In either case, there was no neat, controlled evacuation. The aircraft stalled, snapped over, and went in outside the refinery perimeter, breaking apart in a spray of aluminum and burning fuel. None of Hell's Wench's crew survived. Men in following aircraft saw the crash through gaps in the smoke. They saw a curved scar of fire on the ground where the AI frame and still-armed ordnance disintegrated. They did not see parachutes. But they had seen, just ahead of that, something that burned into their own memories more cleanly than any metal citation. A crippled B-24, on fire and bleeding, staying where it needed to stay in the formation so that the bombs behind it could find their place. After the raid, when the surviving aircraft struggled back to Benghazi, many damaged, some forced down at other fields, the debriefs were long and ugly. Suppression and propaganda would later argue the true effectiveness of tidal wave. Ploiești's output dipped, then recovered. The Germans repaired. Oil flowed again, though never quite as freely. For the crews, that didn't matter as much as which bunks were now empty, which aircraft were missing from dispersal, which names the intelligence officers and chaplains now wrote on lists. From the 93rd Bomb Group's perspective, Addison Baker and John Jerstad had done exactly what they believed their duty demanded. Lead in. Stay on course. Don't break faith with the men who have your tail in their windscreen, even when your own chances of survival have dropped from slim to symbolic. Both men were awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. Their citations, crisp and formal, spoke of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, and detailed their refusal to abandon the bomb run, despite heavy damage and fire. Photo portraits of them went up on walls. Articles were written. Schools and streets would later bear their names. The enemy had their own version of disbelief. Romanian and German flak crews, fighters, and staff officers reviewing the raid afterward were shaken by what they'd seen. Heavy bombers roaring in at each chimney height, threading through balloon cables and towers as if they were attack planes. Burning aircraft that did not peel away, but instead held lead to the very last second. In their reports, some of those officers used the same word Allied planners and commanders would see elsewhere: wahnsinnig. Insane. From a safe distance and decades later, it's easy to nod at those labels and view the whole operation as too costly. 50 B-24s lost, hundreds of men killed, a target that ultimately kept working, other means eventually used to strangle the Reich's fuel. From the perspective of the men in the airplanes that morning, the calculus was more personal and immediate. They'd been given a job: put bombs onto specific aim points in a place the enemy thought they could not be reached. Do it from an altitude where you could see individual workmen running and the textures on smokestacks. Do it knowing that half the men around you might not come back. In that sort of environment, the gap between could have landed safely and flew the burning bomber into the target isn't academic. It's a path chosen, not out of death wish, but out of a very specific, very hard form of professional pride and obligation. Baker and Jerstad could have saved themselves, maybe, by breaking away earlier. So could hundreds of other officers and enlisted men in 100 other missions who chose not to. What sets their story apart is how visible the choice was, and how costly. For pilots and aircrew who read about tidal wave in the years after, the lesson was double-edged. Sometimes pressing the attack in the face of overwhelming fire is exactly what the job demands. Sometimes the men who make that choice don't get to be there when someone pins a small blue ribbon on a uniform. But the men who flew behind them remember. And so do those of us who look at old photos of a smoking B-24 in a hot Romanian sky and understand, in some small way, why someone would keep it in the lead long after self-preservation had suggested another course.